He had faced gods, monsters, and men who thought themselves both. He had been erased from existence, cloned, and fought battles across the fabric of time itself. But nothing, in all his years of impossible adventures, had prepared him for the sensation of being unmade. It was not pain, not precisely. It was a violent tearing of context, a symphony of wrongness where every atom of his being screamed that it was in a place it should not be. One moment he was lunging, webbing the controls of the vulture's reality-distorting talon before it could shred downtown Manhattan. The next, a flash of sickly purple-green light, and the world dissolved into a nauseating smear of color and sound. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions and impossible heroes, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the dark millennium. The return to reality was a mercy and a curse. It came as a singular point of impact, a full-body slam against something cold, unyielding, and slick with filth. Peter Parker's senses exploded back to life. The first was smell, a coppery, acidic tang that burned his nostrils, mixed with the overwhelming stench of unwashed bodies, promethium fumes, and something foully organic, like a slaughterhouse left to rot. Then came sound, the distant, percussive clang of heavy machinery, the faint, overlapping shouts of 1,000 arguments in a language he almost recognized, and a constant, oppressive hum that vibrated up from the grated floor beneath him. So he pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. His suit, the familiar red and blue, was torn at the shoulder and thigh, the smart fabric frayed and useless. A quick, instinctive pat-down confirmed his web shooters were still attached, though the left one's nozzle was clogged with a viscous, rust-colored grime. He cleared it with a practiced flick of his finger. He was in an alley, or its futuristic equivalent. Walls of pitted, weeping metal soared upwards into a darkness so complete he couldn't tell if there was a sky. Pipes, thick as an oak tree and studded with rivets the size of his fist, snaked along the walls, leaking a steady drizzle of foul-smelling liquid that sizzled where it hit the floor. "Okay, Parker, Rule 1. Assess the situation," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding small and thin in the cavernous space. His mask's lenses, usually capable of thermal and night vision, flickered uselessly. Whatever energy pulse had brought him here had fried their delicate systems. He was flying blind. Then his spider sense flared. It wasn't the sharp, stabbing premonition of a fist or a bullet. This was different. It was a low, persistent thrum at the base of his skull, a constant, wide-spectrum broadcast of pure, undiluted dread. It was the background radiation of 1 billion souls living in misery, a psychic scream of oppression so profound it felt like a physical weight. The danger wasn't coming for him. He had simply landed in an ocean of it. He crawled up the nearest wall, the microfibers on his fingertips finding purchase on the slick metal. From a vantage point 100 feet up, clinging to the side of a leaking conduit, he got his first true look at this new world. He was in a city, but the word felt inadequate. This was a metal mountain, a man-made geological feature that ascended into the artificial gloom, its peak lost in smog and darkness. Gothic arches, grotesquely oversized and decorated with skulls and eagles, held up walkways teeming with people. But they were a ragged, downtrodden river of humanity, their faces gaunt, their movements hurried and fearful. There was no joy here. No color, save for the rust, the grime, and the occasional lurid glow of a pick screen displaying a stern, skull-faced sigil he didn't recognize. His gaze fell upon a scene below. A group of men in patchwork armor and crude helmets were beating a younger boy, his face bloody. It was a simple mugging, a scene he had stopped 1,000 times. Before he could even think to move, a squad of larger figures appeared. They wore thick, black carapace armor and helmets that concealed their faces. They didn't shout warnings. They didn't try to arrest anyone. They raised their weapons, heavy, blocky rifles, and opened fire. The crack of the shots was deafening. The muggers and their victim were all cut down in a hail of explosive rounds that turned flesh and bone into a red mist. Peter froze, his knuckles white against the cold metal. He had seen violence, but this was different. This was casual, brutal, and utterly devoid of mercy. This was not law enforcement. It was extermination. As the armored figures moved on, leaving the bodies to be swallowed by the hive's shadows, Peter saw something that chilled him to his core. A hunched figure, its body a horrific fusion of man and machine with whirring servos and a vacant expression, emerged from the shadows with a spray cleaner and a bin. It was a janitor, a lobotomized cybernetic janitor, cleaning up the remnants of the dead with the same detached efficiency one might use to wipe a spill. This place was a nightmare, a dystopia so complete it had mechanized its own apathy. And then his spider sense, already a dull roar, screamed, a sharp, piercing spike of immediate predatory danger. It was so intense it made his vision swim. His head snapped in the direction of the feeling, towards the darkest recesses of another alley across the chasm. So, for a split second, he saw a distortion in the air. A shimmering, chameleon-like effect against the metal wall, something that was there and not there simultaneously. It was tall, impossibly slender, and it moved with a liquid grace that was utterly alien. Then it was gone. The scent of ozone and a strange, musky odor drifted on the recycled air. The hum of the hive continued its mournful song. But now, underneath it all, Peter could feel a new and terrible note. Something was hunting in this metal jungle, and his senses told him it was not a man, not a machine, but something else entirely. Something hungry. He was alone, wounded, and stranded in a universe that casually murdered its own for the crime of being a victim, and in that universe, a monster was hiding in the shadows. For the first time in a long time, Peter Parker felt a genuine tremor of fear. This wasn't home. This was a tomb. The brutal efficiency of the armored enforcers was a paradigm shift for Peter. He'd fought police, soldiers, and SHIELD agents who were often misguided or controlled, but their underlying mission was theoretically to protect. These figures, the Arbets, as he'd heard one bystander hiss, were butchers in uniform. Their actions had recalibrated his understanding of this place. There was no safety net. There was no law, only control. He retreated deeper into the warren of pipes and gantries, putting as much distance and verticality as possible between himself and the street-level display of state-sanctioned murder. His mind, a frantic engine of logic and science, was spinning its wheels, trying to gain traction on a surface of pure insanity. For the next cycle, he couldn't call it a day. As the oppressive gloom never changed, Peter became a ghost. He moved through the hive's upper levels, a silent observer in red and blue. He listened, his senses sharp. The language was a twisted, guttural form of English, littered with unfamiliar jargon. Throne, gelt, scum. He pieced together a terrifying mosaic of the society he'd fallen into. This was Hive Primus, on a world called Necromunda, a colossal factory city dedicated to producing arms for a galactic empire ruled by a distant, godlike emperor. The people were cogs in a machine they couldn't see, their lives measured in production quotas and obedience. Heresy, mutation, and unsanctioned thought were crimes punishable by immediate public death. His stomach ached with a hunger so sharp it was dizzying. He watched people trade ration bars, bland, gray bricks of protein, for scraps of metal or whispered information. He saw a child steal one and receive a savage beating from a merchant, a crowd gathering not to help, but to watch the grim entertainment. Peter's every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to drop down and deliver a dose of great power, great responsibility. But he hesitated. The memory of the Arbits' explosive rounds was seared into his mind. If he revealed himself, he wouldn't be seen as a hero. He'd be labeled a mutant, a heretic. He'd be put down like the muggers and their victim, and then he'd be no good to anyone, least of all himself, in getting back home. Survival, for now, had to be the priority. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Through it all, his spider sense remained a roaring torment. The background dread was a constant headache, psychic static that frayed his nerves. But amidst the noise, the other signal grew clearer, the sharp, cold signature of the predator. It was a moving pinpoint of malice that ghosted through the hive's infrastructure. It would appear in one sector, a spike of focused intent, then vanish, only to reappear miles away moments later. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its passage. It moved with a purpose that was terrifyingly patient. Down in the slums of Dust Falls, where the hive's toxic effluence rained down in a perpetual corrosive drizzle, whispers gave the feeling a name. The Sump Stalker, the Guttergast. At first, Peter dismissed it as local folklore, the kind of ghost story any oppressed society would invent to explain the unexplainable. But the stories were too frequent, too consistent. People were vanishing. Not just gangers or lone wanderers, but entire families from behind sealed HAB unit doors. One moment they were there, their life signs registered on the block's Medica station, and the next, they were gone. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. Just an empty space where people used to be. He started tracking it. Not the creature itself, but the fear it left in its wake. He'd swing silently through the gantries, his webs a lifeline in the oppressive darkness, and follow the panicked whispers. He found a HAB block where a family of 4 had disappeared only an hour before. The local enforcers had already been and gone, declaring it a HAB unit malfunction and sealing the door with a stencil of the double-headed eagle. Peter pried the door open with his fingertips, the metal groaning in protest. The inside was unnervingly neat. A table was set with bowls of fungal stew, now cold. A child's toy, a crudely carved wooden soldier, lay on the floor. There was no blood, no chaos, but the air was thick with a cloying alien scent, like rotting cinnamon and ozone. It was the same smell he had caught a whiff of in the alley. His spider sense tingled, not with danger, but with a residual echo of it. Something had been here. He ran a gloved finger along the wall, his senses hyper-attuned. Nothing. Then, under a grimy ventilation grate, he saw it. A single, almost invisible smear of translucent purple fluid. He touched it. It was slick, and it evaporated almost instantly, leaving no trace. It was biological. "This isn't a ghost," he murmured, the sound swallowed by the silence of the room. "This is a hunt." The creature wasn't just killing, it was collecting. Erasing its tracks with a chilling precision. This was the work of an apex predator, something that had evolved for stealth and efficiency. It was treating this billion-soul hive city as its personal hunting ground. And no one in power seemed to care, because it was only hunting the poor, the forgotten, the dregs who wouldn't be missed by the Imperial machine. His resolve hardened. He couldn't go home, not yet. He couldn't fix this broken, brutal world. But he could do this. He could stop the monster that was stalking the shadows. It was a problem he could understand. Find the bully. Stop the bully. This one was just bigger, uglier, and had more arms than usual. As he stood in the silent, violated home, his spider sense suddenly exploded. The dull ache became a blinding, ice-pick agony in his skull. It was close, incredibly close. And it was active. A chorus of screams echoed from 2 levels below, sharp and terrified, before being abruptly cut off. The predator was hunting again. Right now. Peter didn't hesitate. He launched himself out of the HAB unit's window, a silent projectile of red and blue against the grime-caked metal of the hive. He shot a web line, the thwip of the shooter a familiar comfort in this alien hell. and swung down into the darkness, accelerating towards the source of the screams. The time for observation was over. He landed in a three-point crouch on the railing of a high gantry, the impact silent save for the soft crunch of corroded metal dust. Below him, a wider platform served as a makeshift trading post, its stalls shuttered and dark. A group of 5 figures, clad in patched-up flak jackets and thick coveralls, stood back-to-back in the center of the space. They were gangers, their affiliation marked by the stylized iron eagle tattoos on their necks. They clutched autoguns and stubbers, weapons that were crude but deadly, yet their knuckles were white with fear, their eyes darting into the impenetrable shadows that pressed in from all sides. One of them was already down, a crumpled shape on the floor. Peter's enhanced vision picked out the horrific wound. The man's chest had been pierced clean through by something impossibly sharp, a wound so precise it looked surgical. "Show yourself, you sump-spawned freak," one of the gangers roared, his voice a mixture of bravado and raw terror. He sprayed a burst of auto fire into the darkness, the muzzle flash a brief, violent flower of light. The bullets ricocheted off metal walls with angry whines, finding no target. Peter's spider sense wasn't just a spike anymore. It was a sustained, high-frequency scream that pinpointed a location directly above the gangers. He looked up, scanning the tangled mess of pipes and conduits. Nothing. Just dripping grime and rust, but his sense insisted. It's right there. Then, a flicker, a distortion in the air like heat haze on a summer street. The shimmer solidified, peeling itself away from the darkness with a chilling, liquid grace. It was as if a patch of shadow had decided to become a creature. It was a nightmare given form, at least 9 feet tall. It was a skeletal thing of purple and gray chitin. Its body, a perfect, horrifying fusion of insectoid and reptilian features. 2 primary limbs, long and multi-jointed, ended in scything talons the length of a man's arm, gleaming like polished obsidian. A second, smaller pair of arms were tipped with wicked claws. Its head was a tapered cowl of armored plate, its face a mask of cold alien intelligence with multiple unblinking eyes that glowed with a faint inner light. From its jaw, a cluster of feeder tendrils uncoiled with a wet, clicking sound. The Lictor. Before the gangers could even register its appearance, it dropped. It didn't make a sound, falling with the silence of a snowflake. It landed directly behind the shouting leader, its talons raised. "Look out!" Peter yelled, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He fired a web line, not at the creature, but at the ganger. The webbing struck the man's chest, and Peter yanked hard, pulling him off his feet just as the lictor's talons sliced through the air where his throat had been. The sound of the blow, a sharp hiss of displaced air, was more terrifying than any gunshot. Peter swung down, a streak of impossible red and blue in the perpetual twilight of the underhive. "Hey, ugly!" he shouted, the quip a reflex born of 1,000 desperate fights. "Didn't your mother ever teach you not to play with your food?" He landed between the creature and the stunned gangers. The Lictor turned its head, its multiple eyes fixing on him. There was no anger, no malice in its gaze. Just a cold, calculating assessment. A butcher sizing up a new piece of meat. It let out a low chittering sound, a noise that vibrated in Peter's bones. The remaining gangers, their bravado shattered by the sight of the monster, finally broke. They scrambled backwards, firing wildly. The bullets sparked and screeched against the Lictor's chitinous side, having little to no effect. The creature ignored them completely, its entire focus now on the brightly colored anomaly that had interfered with its hunt. It moved. It didn't charge. It simply flowed. One moment it was 20 feet away, the next it was on him, its primary talons a gleaming arc of death. Peter's spider sense was his only salvation. He threw himself backwards, contorting his body in midair as the talons passed so close. He felt the wind of their passage. He fired both web shooters. One glob of webbing struck the creature's face, momentarily obscuring its vision. The other caught one of its scything talons, the incredibly strong polymer stretching taut. The lictor paused, a flicker of what might have been surprise in its alien posture. It tore the webbing from its face with its smaller claws, the sticky substance parting with a sound like tearing sinew. It examined the web on its talon with detached curiosity before severing the line with a flick of its smaller claws. From the gantries and walkways above, figures had begun to emerge from their hovels, drawn by the gunfire. They were the forgotten, the hive scum, their faces pale and gaunt in the gloom. They watched in stunned silence, their fear of the monster warring with their awe at the sight of the impossible man in red and blue. He moved like nothing they had ever seen, a dancer in a world of shambling brutes. A whisper started, a name born of the moment, the Ghost Spinner. The lictor lunged again, this time leading with its smaller claws, a feint. Peter's senses screamed a warning, and he leaped upwards, sticking to the underside of the gantry above just as the creature's massive talons swept the spot where he'd been standing. He then propelled himself off the ceiling, aiming a powerful kick at the creature's head. His boot connected with a crack that echoed through the plaza, a blow that would have sent a normal man flying. The lictor's head snapped to the side, but it barely took a step back. It was like kicking a statue made of living stone. It turned its head back, its feeder tendrils writhing in agitation. It had registered him as a threat, and then a new sound. The heavy, rhythmic stomp of armored boots. A vox command cut through the air, cold and devoid of emotion. All units target the anomalies. Xenos and mutant. Purge with extreme prejudice. A beam of intense light cut through the darkness, pinning both Peter and the lictor in its glare. On a walkway overlooking the plaza, a squad of 5 Arbites stood, their black carapace armor and full-face helmets making them look as inhuman as the Tyranid creature they were targeting. They raised their combat shotguns and bolters, the red dots of laser sights dancing across Peter's chest and the lictor's chitin. The lictor, intelligent and patient, immediately reassessed the situation. Too many witnesses. A new, heavily armed threat. Its hunt was compromised. It made a low hissing sound, a sound of frustration. And with a speed that defied physics, it leapt backwards into the shadows. Its chameleonic skin shimmered, and in the space of a heartbeat, it vanished completely. Peter was left alone in the spotlight, standing over the cowering forms of the gangers he had just saved, with a dozen high-caliber weapons aimed directly at his head. His heroic debut had just turned into his public execution. "Target confirmed," the Arbit's Vox speaker crackled, the voice metallic and cold. "Mutant designation, Spinner, open fire." There was no warning shot. The world erupted in a storm of fire and thunder. Peter's spider sense shrieked, a razor-sharp wave of input that allowed him to move before the first shot was even fired. He threw himself sideways, a blur of motion, as a volley of explosive bolts tore through the air where he had been standing. They impacted the metal floor behind him, detonating with enough force to vaporize chunks of the platform, sending molten shrapnel screaming into the darkness. Bolters. He now knew the name for the weapons that had executed the men in the alley. They weren't just guns. They were miniature rocket launchers. He shot a web line to the ceiling and launched himself upwards, the Arbit's shots tracking him with disciplined precision. This was a different class of opponent from street thugs. They were trained soldiers, and their only goal was his annihilation. As he swung through the oppressive gloom, another spotlight flared to life, catching him mid-air. He was a perfect target. Then, chaos erupted from a new quarter. From the deepest shadows below the Arbit's walkway, the lictor re-emerged. It moved with impossible speed, a purple-grey streak of death that flowed up the wall. The Arbites on the end of the line didn't even have time to scream. The creature's scything talons plunged through the man's black carapace armor with a sound of screeching, tearing metal. It lifted him effortlessly, his bolter clattering to the floor, and held him for a single, horrifying moment before its feeder tendrils lashed out, punching through his helmet's visor. The remaining 4 arbiters reacted instantly, pivoting to face the greater threat. Bolter rounds hammered into the Lictor's torso, but the creature was already in motion, using its victim's body as a gruesome shield. It tossed the dead soldier aside and lunged, a whirlwind of chitin and blades. This was Peter's chance to escape. The logical part of his brain, the part that screamed for self-preservation, told him to swing away into the darkness and never look back. But he couldn't. He couldn't leave these men, brutal and murderous as they were, to be slaughtered by that thing. It wasn't in his DNA. With great power. He dropped back down to the main platform, landing with a soft thud. "Hey, stab happy!" he yelled, firing 2 thick web lines that splattered against the side of the Lictor's head. "The bald guys in black are the bad guys. I'm the good guy. Try to keep up." The distraction worked. The Lictor, momentarily blinded, paused its assault on the Arbites. It brought its smaller claws up, methodically scraping the thick webbing from its multiple eyes. The 2 remaining Arbites, 2 others had already been dismembered by the creature's blindingly fast assault, used the opening to fall back, laying down suppressing fire. The Lictor ignored them. It turned its full, terrifying attention back to Peter. It recognized him now not just as an obstacle, but as a persistent, infuriating threat. It let out a piercing shriek, a sound that was both biological and mechanical, a high-frequency blast of pure alien hatred that made Peter's teeth ache. Then the dance began. The Lictor didn't charge. It bounded, using the walls and ceiling as if gravity were a suggestion. It was shockingly, impossibly fast, a living missile of sharpened bone and muscle. Peter met its speed with his own unique brand of acrobatic chaos. He flipped, dodged, and swung, his movements dictated not by thought, but by the pure, precognitive input of his spider sense. A talon sliced through the air, aimed at his chest. Peter contorted backwards, his spine bending at an impossible angle, the tip of the blade grazing the spider emblem on his suit arm. He retaliated with a web line, snagging the creature's ankle and pulling. The Lictor was impossibly strong. It barely stumbled, instead using the tension in the web to swing its other leg around in a devastating kick. Peter had to sever the line and leap away to avoid having his ribs crushed. Every instinct screamed at him. He saw a dozen openings where a lethal blow would land, a jab to the eyes, a focused strike to a joint. But he couldn't do it. He pulled every punch, turning killing blows into shoves. He was trying to disable, to subdue. The Lictor, however, was not bound by such rules. Every single one of its movements was a killing stroke. It was the most efficient, purely homicidal opponent he had ever faced. There was no emotion driving it, no greed or rage. It was simply following its biological imperative. It was a living weapon, and its function was to kill him. He dodged another scythe-like sweep and came in close, planting both feet on the creature's chest and pushing off, putting some distance between them. The chitinous armor was slick and strangely warm, like the skin of a reptile. He landed on a pile of discarded crates, his mind racing. He couldn't hurt it. His punches, strong enough to dent steel, felt like slaps against its armored hide. His webs, strong enough to hold a car, were a temporary annoyance it could sever with a flick of its claws. The Lictor paused, its head tilted. It was learning, adapting. It had stopped making wide, sweeping attacks and was now using faster, more precise stabs, trying to predict his dodges. Peter realized with a jolt of ice-cold fear that it was herding him, cutting off his escape routes, trying to pin him against a wall where his agility would mean nothing. He had to end this. Now. Spying a massive, jury-rigged power conduit hanging precariously from the ceiling, he formulated a desperate plan. He leapt high, drawing the Lictor's attention upwards. as the creature followed him, scaling the wall with unnatural ease. Peter fired a volley of web gobs, not at the creature, but at the rusted clamps holding the conduit in place. He then attached 2 lines to the conduit itself. "Timber!" he yelled. With a grunt of exertion, he put all his strength into a single, massive pull. The rusted clamps groaned, then snapped. The conduit, thick as a subway car and sparking with raw, untamed power, crashed downwards. The Lictor, caught by surprise, was directly beneath it. It tried to leap away, but it was too late. The massive weight didn't crush it, but slammed it against the platform, pinning its lower body. Raw electricity arced across its chitin, causing it to convulse and shriek, a sound of agony that was utterly alien. The Lictor thrashed, its scything talons scoring deep gouges in the metal floor. With a scream of effort, it managed to heave the conduit off itself and wriggle free. Its hide was scorched black in places, and a foul-smelling ichorous fluid leaked from a dozen minor wounds. It was hurt. For the first time, it was genuinely hurt. It fixed its glowing eyes on Peter, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of something new from the creature. Not just predatory instinct, but fury. It gathered itself to spring, to finish this fight, but it hesitated. Its alien mind processed the new data. Its prey was far more dangerous and resourceful than anticipated. The hunt was no longer efficient. With a final, frustrated hiss that sounded like tearing metal, the Lictor's skin began to shimmer. It faded, blending into the background of rust and shadow until it was nothing more than a distortion in the air. Then, it was gone. Peter was left standing on the ruined platform, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His body ached, and his web fluid cartridges were dangerously low. The fight had lasted less than a minute, but it had been one of the most draining encounters of his life. He had survived. He hadn't won, not by a long shot. He had just made himself a more trouble than the meal was worth. He turned, his senses still screaming, just in time to see the 2 surviving Arbets step out from behind cover. Their armor was scratched and dented, their professional calm shattered, replaced by a mixture of terror and grim duty. The Xenos was gone. The mutant remained. One of them raised his bolter, the barrel aimed squarely at Peter's heart. "Do not move, mutant," the voice crackled. "By the authority of the Adeptus Arbits, you are under sentence of death." He held up his hands, a universal gesture of surrender he hoped hadn't been lost in the dimensional translation. "Look, fellas, I'm not the guy you want. The big stabby bug monster. He's the problem. I was helping." The lead arbiter's bolter didn't waver. "Heresy is the problem, mutant. Unsanctioned action is the problem. Your existence is the problem." The second arbiter, armed with a heavy combat shotgun and a thick suppression shield, began to advance, his movements stiff and deliberate. Peter's mind raced. He was drained, his muscles screaming from the fight with the Lictor. His web shooters were nearly empty. He could probably take these 2, but not without hurting them, and the thought of breaking some poor, brainwashed cop's arm, even these murderous ones, left a sour taste in his mouth. More importantly, the sound of their bolters would draw every enforcer in this sector. He needed to disappear, not escalate. "All right, look. No hard feelings," Peter said, slowly backing away. "You have a nice, grim, oppressive day. I'll just be going." He turned to leap into the shadows, but the arbiter with the shield was faster than he looked. He slammed the shield's edge against the floor, and with a loud hiss, a net woven from metallic fibers shot out, weighted at the corners. It was a standard crowd suppression tool. For Peter, it was moving in slow motion. He sidestepped it easily, letting it clatter uselessly against a wall. "Really? A net?" he quipped, a hint of his usual bravado returning. "What's next? A giant birdcage?" The lead arbiter fired. Not a bolter round, but something else. A canister flew from an underbarrel launcher. Peter's spider sense gave him a vague warning, not of impact, but of disorientation. He leapt sideways, but the canister detonated in midair with a blinding flash and a deafening shriek of sonic energy. The effect on his enhanced senses was catastrophic. His world dissolved into a firestorm of white light and agonizing noise. The high-frequency pitch felt like a physical spike being driven through his skull. His spider sense, already a raw nerve from the Hive's background dread, overloaded completely, turning from a warning system into an instrument of pure torture. He cried out, staggering, his hands flying to his head. His equilibrium vanished. The floor tilted like the deck of a sinking ship. He collapsed to one knee, disoriented and helpless. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard the heavy stomp of the Arbite's boots approaching. He tried to push himself up to fight through the sensory assault, but his body wouldn't respond. This was a weapon perfectly designed to neutralize someone like him. Subject is disoriented. The lead arbiter's voice crackled, distorted by the lingering sonic waves. Move in, apply restraints. A heavy weight slammed into his back, driving the air from his lungs. The second arbiter had tackled him, using the suppression shield to pin him to the grated floor. Peter's strength, even diminished, was still immense. He could have thrown the man off, but he was still fighting the vertigo, the world spinning around him. Cold, heavy metal cuffs were snapped onto his wrists. He felt a faint, tingling sensation, and his muscles suddenly felt like lead. The cuffs hummed with a low-level energy field, a stasis lock that seemed to sap his strength directly. Restraints active, the arbiter grunted, pressing his knee harder into Peter's spine. The mutant is secure. With a rough heave, they pulled him to his feet. One of them reached up and tore his mask from his head. The recycled, foul-smelling air of the underhive hit his face. He blinked, his vision slowly clearing, the blinding spots fading to a dull afterimage. The two Arbites stared at his face, their helmeted heads tilted in what might have been confusion. They saw no fangs, no extra eyes, no signs of grotesque mutation. They saw the face of a young man, barely out of his teens, with sweat-plastered brown hair and a defiant, weary look in his eyes. This, somehow, seemed to disturb them more than any physical deformity would have. No visible mutation, one of them reported into his vox. Subject appears baseline human, yet displays abnormal capabilities. Before a reply could come, a new sound cut through the air. It was a crisp, disciplined marching, far more coordinated than the Arbit's heavy tread. A new squad of soldiers emerged from the gloom. They were larger than the Arbits, clad in perfectly maintained, deep crimson carapace armor, their helmets concealing their faces behind polished silver visors. They carried sleek, compact rifles, hell guns, he would later learn, with a lethal professionalism that made the local enforcers look like clumsy thugs. These were Tempestus Scions, the elite soldiery of the Imperium, and they were not alone. Behind them walked a figure who radiated an aura of absolute authority. He was a tall man, clad in a long, black leather coat over a simple, dark tunic. His face was sharp and severe, marked by a life of grim duty with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. A silver, stylized eye hung on a chain around his neck. He carried no weapon, but he didn't need to. His very presence was a weapon. The two Arbits snapped to attention, their posture rigid with a fear that bordered on reverence. "Inquisitor," the lead arbiter stammered. We have secured the anomaly." The Inquisitor's cold eyes fell upon Peter. He surveyed him from head to foot, his gaze lingering on the strange red and blue costume, the web shooters on his wrists, and finally, his unmasked face. It was a look of intense, analytical scrutiny, like a biologist examining a new and potentially venomous insect. "You have contained it," the Inquisitor said, his voice calm and resonant, cutting through the Hive's clamor. "Securing it is another matter entirely. My men will take custody." He gave a curt nod to the scions. The Arbits stepped back immediately, their duty fulfilled. The scions moved in, their efficiency terrifying. They checked his restraints, adding a second, heavier set to his ankles. One of them held up a scanner, a small, intricate device that hummed as it bathed Peter in a pale green light. "No detectable warp signature, my lord," the scion reported. "Physiology is human, but density of muscle and bone tissue is off the charts. Cellular regeneration is abnormally high." The Inquisitor's gaze narrowed. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "You have caused a great deal of trouble, stranger. You interfered with an ongoing Ordo Xenos investigation, revealed yourself to the local populace, and engaged a Tyranid vanguard organism." He took a step closer, his eyes boring into Peter's. "The question is, are you a new breed of heretic, a tool of some unseen power, or just a fool who has stumbled into a war far beyond his comprehension?" Peter met his gaze, his head still throbbing. He didn't answer. He knew with absolute certainty that any explanation he gave, alternate dimensions, radioactive spiders, a sense of civic duty, would be interpreted as either madness or lies. The Inquisitor smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his severe face. "Silence will not protect you. I have ways of making even the dead speak. Take him." The scions hauled him away, his boots dragging on the metal floor. As they led him onto the walkway, he looked down at the plaza below. The bodies of the dead gangers and the dismembered Arbites were still there, but huddled in the doorways and on the gantries were the people of the underhive. They stared up at him, their faces a mixture of fear, shock, and something else. Something he hadn't seen yet in this dark, miserable world. A flicker of hope. He had fought the monster. He had appeared from nowhere, a flash of impossible color and courage. He was a hero to them. And as the Inquisitor's men dragged him into the darkness, he realized his capture was now their proof that in the 41st millennium, hope was the greatest heresy of all. The transition from the grimy, chaotic underhive to the Inquisitor's sanctum was as jarring as the dimensional leap that had brought him here. There was no journey he could remember, only the lingering disorientation from the sonic blast, and then a sharp, stinging sensation in his neck. He awoke with a gasp, not to darkness, but to a cold, sterile light. He was seated, or more accurately, fused to a massive iron chair. Thick, humming restraints bound his wrists, ankles, and torso. A heavy metal collar was clamped around his neck, and a network of fine silver wires snaked from it, disappearing into the chair's arcane machinery. The air was frigid, tasting of ozone and sterile filtration. The room was a perfect circle of dark, polished stone, its walls lined with humming cogitator banks and shelves of ancient, leather-bound data slates. A single, grotesque ornament floated silently in the center of the room. A human skull, augmented with whirring lenses and a small anti-grav motor, its eye sockets glowing with a soft red light. A servo skull. Across the room, standing before a vast star chart that showed unfamiliar constellations, was the Inquisitor. He had removed his long coat, revealing the simple, severe black uniform of his office. He did not turn. "Your name," the Inquisitor stated. It was not a question. "Peter Parker." A meaningless designation. "Your world of origin." Peter hesitated. The truth sounded insane even to him. A different universe, another reality. I was brought here by a scientific accident. The Inquisitor turned slowly, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "There is only one reality, boy. The reality of the God Emperor of mankind. What you call other universes, we know by a truer name, the Immaterium, the realm of chaos. You are claiming to be warp spawn." "No, that's not it," Peter insisted, struggling against the restraints. The energy field hummed, and a wave of weakness washed over him. "It's physics, M-theory. There are parallel dimensions, completely separate from each other. No magic, no chaos, just different universal constants. The Inquisitor approached the chair, his steps slow and deliberate. The servo skull drifted alongside him, its lenses whirring as it focused on Peter's face. You speak of science as if it were a religion. In the Imperium, we have learned to treat it with the caution it deserves. Unsanctioned knowledge is the back door to heresy. Your powers, your unnatural strength, your precognitive senses, the adhesive filaments you project. From where do they originate? It was an accident, Peter said, his voice strained. I was bitten by a genetically engineered spider. It rewrote parts of my DNA. The Inquisitor stopped just a few feet away, a flicker of something, disdain, perhaps pity in his eyes. A spider, he repeated, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. You were bitten. Do you take me for a fool? You carry the taint of mutation. Whether it was the touch of a demon in the immaterium or a forbidden genetic rite, the result is the same. You are an aberration. I use my powers to help people, Peter shot back, his frustration boiling over. That's what I was doing down there. I was saving those people from that thing. Saving them. The Inquisitor let out a short, humorless laugh. You saved nothing. You prolonged the inevitable misery of 5 worthless hive gangers who would have died on a rival's blade or at the end of an Arbite's shotgun within the week. In doing so, you revealed your existence, created a spectacle, and fostered the most dangerous contraband in the entire Imperium. Hope. You gave the scum of the Hive a symbol, a ghost spinner to whisper about in the dark. That is the seed of sedition. Peter stared, aghast. They were going to die. Human lives have value. Incorrect. The Inquisitor's voice was as cold and sharp as a scalpel. Individual lives have no value. The continued survival of humanity has value. The will of the Emperor has value. I would sacrifice this entire Hab block to the Lictor to learn more about its infiltration patterns. I would burn this entire Hive city to the ground to prevent a full-scale Tyranid invasion. Your sentimental, small-minded morality is a weakness this galaxy cannot afford. The words hit Peter harder than any physical blow. This man, this entire system, was built on a foundation of monstrous, pragmatic arithmetic where human lives were just numbers on a balance sheet. The casual brutality of the Arbits wasn't an aberration. It was policy. The creature you fought, the Inquisitor continued, his tone shifting to one of cold analysis, is a Lictor, a vanguard organism of the Tyranid Hive Fleet. It is a scout, an infiltrator. It does not hunt for sport or for sustenance alone. It hunts to learn. It tastes the genetic makeup of its prey, analyzes the strengths and weaknesses of the local defenders. It is a reconnaissance weapon of unparalleled perfection. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And now it has tasted you. It has registered a life form of unknown origin with capabilities that defy all known biological parameters. You have not just interfered with a hunt. You have made yourself the single most interesting piece of biomass on this entire planet. A cold dread washed over Peter, a fear more profound than any he had felt before. The Lictor wasn't just a monster, it was a scout, and he had just painted a giant, glowing target on his back for an entire swarm of creatures just like it. You are a weapon, Peter Parker, the Inquisitor said, his eyes gleaming with a new, terrifying light. Your unsanctioned idealism makes you a danger, but your power could be a tool. The question is whether you can be broken, reforged, and aimed, or if you are simply an unholy anomaly that must be dissected, studied, and ultimately purged. He turned and walked back towards the star chart, leaving Peter alone with his thoughts and the silent, watching servo skull. The Inquisitor didn't need to torture him. He had already shown Peter the truth of this universe, that his entire moral code, the very foundation of his identity as Spider-Man, was considered a fatal flaw. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, responsibility was a heresy, and compassion was a death sentence. The Inquisitor, who Peter now mentally tagged as Inquisitor Gloom and Doom, let the weight of his pronouncement settle in the sterile air. The servo skull drifted closer to Peter, its optical lenses whirring as it recorded his micro-expressions, cataloguing his fear, his disbelief, his dawning comprehension. "You believe you fought a monster," the Inquisitor, Valerius, began again, his voice a low, chilling lecture. He gestured towards the star chart, which shimmered and changed, displaying a swirling, angry nebula of deep purple and black. "You fought a single cell of a galactic cancer. You have no true conception of what the Tyranid is. Allow me to enlighten you." He paced before the chart, a teacher in a classroom of damnation. "They are the Great Devourer, a locust storm that blots out the stars, moving from one galaxy to the next, leaving only dead worlds in its wake. They are not a species in the way you would understand it. They are a single gestalt organism, a hive mind of unimaginable psychic potency stretching across the void. Every creature, from the smallest ripper to the mightiest hive tyrant, is a synaptic extension of its will. They do not feel fear or hate or ambition. They feel only hunger, a hunger that is absolute." Peter listened, his scientific mind trying to grapple with the biological impossibility of it all. A single consciousness controlling trillions of bodies across light years of space. It was terrifying, but it was also fascinating. "A hive mind, like an ant colony?" he asked, the question a reflex. Valerius shot him a look of utter contempt. "Comparing the hive mind to an insect colony is like comparing a picked capture of a fire to a supernova. The hive mind is a psychic entity of such power that its very approach is a weapon. It projects a suffocating psychic blanket across entire star systems, the shadow in the warp. It smothers psyches, drives men mad, and cuts off astropathic communication, isolating its prey before the first shot is even fired. The dread you felt, the constant psychic background noise of this hive, that is a whisper compared to the soul-crushing silence of the shadow." The Inquisitor pointed a finger at the swirling purple nebula on the chart. "That is the main body of Hive Fleet Leviathan, a tendril of which is currently tearing a bloody path through the galactic east. What we face here is a splinter fleet, a tiny, broken fragment of that main body, cast adrift after a battle. But a single drop from a poisoned ocean is still lethal." He walked back towards Peter, his eyes burning with a zealot's intensity. "When the fleet arrives at a target world, the horror truly begins. It is not an invasion, it is a harvest. They seed the atmosphere with spores that rewrite the planet's flora and fauna into hyper-aggressive nightmares. They seed the oceans, turning them into a digestive soup. They deploy billions of organisms that do not stop, do not sleep, and do not surrender until every living thing on the planet has been consumed. They don't just kill you, boy. They eat you. They absorb your biomass, your genetic code, every scrap of biological matter. Then, when the world is scoured clean, they drink the oceans and inhale the atmosphere. They leave nothing but a barren, airless rock. And then they move on, stronger and more adapted than before." The sheer, cosmic scale of the threat was suffocating. Peter had fought villains who wanted to rule the world, to destroy a city, to gain ultimate power. He had never faced an enemy whose victory condition was to literally eat everything. "The Lictor," Valerius said, bringing the lecture back to the immediate, "is the tip of that spear. It is the most advanced infiltrator the hive mind has yet devised. It is spawned for a single purpose, to find the most valuable, most resilient biomass on a world before the main swarm arrives. It operates in silence, in darkness, evading all conventional detection. It hunts, it tastes, it learns, and then it relays that information back to the Splinter Fleet, painting a target for the primary assault. Peter's blood ran cold. "You're saying it's calling them?" "It hasn't yet, but it is gathering the data to do so," Valerius corrected. "It uses complex pheromone trails, undetectable to our technology, to signal its findings. Once it has gathered sufficient intelligence on this hive's defenses and its unique biological anomalies, it will leave a psychic beacon, a homing signal so powerful it will draw the rest of the splinter fleet here like a carrion vulture to a corpse." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The missing families, the lack of bodies. The Lictor wasn't just killing for sport. It was taking samples. The hive wasn't being terrorized. It was being catalogued. It was being tasted. "This hive city," Valerius stated with chilling finality, "with its billion souls, its millennia of industry, its devotion to the God Emperor, is nothing more than an appetizer to the Great Devourer, a morsel on the galactic menu, and your interference has just seasoned the dish to perfection. The hive mind is the ultimate predator, and it is obsessed with adaptation. It seeks out new genetic material to absorb, new tricks to learn. And you, Peter Parker, with your impossible strength and spider-like agility, are the most exotic genetic cocktail it has encountered in this entire sector. It will want you. It will want to know how you work. It will send its best hunters to retrieve you, to break you down, and to add your abilities to its own terrible arsenal." Peter stared into the Inquisitor's merciless eyes, and for the first time, he understood. The Lictor wasn't just a threat. It was the threat. Stopping it wasn't just about saving a few families in the underhive. It was about stopping the dinner bell from being rung for an apocalypse. And he, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, had just made himself the main course. The weight of Valerius's revelation pressed down on Peter, a physical force that made the humming restraints feel even tighter. He wasn't just a stranger in a strange land anymore. He was the catalyst for an extinction-level event. 1 billion lives were now balanced on a knife's edge, and his very existence was the reason. The mantra that had defined his life, "With great power comes great responsibility," had never felt so crushingly heavy. "So, what's your plan?" Peter asked, his voice low and serious. "You're an Inquisitor. You have soldiers, authority. How do you stop it?" Valerius turned away, a dismissive wave of his hand. "My methods are not your concern. The situation is being handled. I've deployed kill teams of my best scions, armed with Auspex scanners and Promethium flamers. We are sweeping the lower levels, sector by sector. We will find it, and we will burn it out." "You'll never find it that way," Peter said immediately. "It's too fast, too smart. It doesn't leave tracks you can see. It moves through the spaces between things. By the time your soldiers get a lock on it, it's already gone. I could feel it just before it was about to attack. I can track that feeling." "Your spider sense," Valerius scoffed. "An unsanctioned psychic mutation. Unreliable. Prone to the whispers of the warp. It is as much a liability as a tool. I will not risk a critical operation on the back of a mutant's intuitions." "It's not intuition, it's precognition," Peter argued, straining against the cuffs. "It's a quantifiable, physical reaction to danger, and it's the only thing on this entire planet that can keep up with that creature. You need me." The Inquisitor turned back, a cold fire in his eyes. "I need nothing from you but the secrets locked in your genetic code. You are a prize, not a partner. You will remain here, secured, until I have dealt with the Lictor. Then your own interrogation will begin in earnest." He motioned to the servo school. "Watch him," he commanded, then turned and strode out of the chamber, the heavy stone door sliding shut behind him with a final, booming echo. Peter was left alone in the cold, sterile silence, with only the whirring, skull-faced drone for a guard. Desperation began to set in. Valerius was arrogant. He was going to use a hammer to catch smoke. His soldiers would be picked off one by one, and all the while, The Lictor would be gathering its intelligence, getting closer and closer to sending its signal. He couldn't just sit here. He had to act. He began to test the restraints. He pulled, gently at first, then with more force. The stasis field hummed louder, and a wave of nausea and weakness washed over him. They were directly siphoning his strength. Fighting them head-on was a losing battle. He relaxed, his mind racing. Think, Parker. Think. You've gotten out of worse. He thought of traps set by the Trapster, Craven, Dr. Octopus. They were all geniuses, but they were human. They thought in terms of locks and keys, force and counterforce. These restraints were different. They were a product of this universe's brutal, dogmatic approach to technology. He looked at his web shooters, still on his wrists, just beyond the edge of the cuffs. The Scions had examined them, but seeing no obvious trigger mechanism, had deemed them an inert part of his strange costume. A critical mistake. He focused, straining not to pull, but to twist his hand at an unnatural angle within the cuff. It was agonizing, his bones grinding together, but he had a degree of flexibility far beyond a normal human. With a final, painful wrench, he managed to get just enough clearance. His middle and ring fingers, pressed together, could just reach the palm of his hand. He pressed the trigger sequence. Thwip. A thin, surprisingly strong strand of web fluid shot out, slapping against the face of the floating servo skull. It was a perfect shot. The drone, its optical lenses suddenly obscured, began to bob erratically, its internal programming confused by the sudden sensory deprivation. It emitted a series of distressed binary chirps. Peter knew he had seconds. He fired another web line, this one aimed at the ceiling. Then, using the last of his flexibility, he aimed the shooter down and fired a third line that stuck fast to the base of the iron chair itself. He now had 2 anchor points. He took a deep breath. This was going to hurt. He contracted the muscles in his arms, putting a massive, explosive strain on both web lines simultaneously. He wasn't pulling against the chair's restraints anymore. He was pitting the chair against the ceiling. The effect was immediate. The web lines, designed to support the weight of a falling car, went taut as iron bars. The chair, bolted to the floor with the Imperium's signature over-engineering, held fast, but the ceiling, a slab of decorative stone, was the weaker link. With a screech of protesting metal and a crack of fracturing rock, a huge chunk of the ceiling tore free. It didn't fall. It swung, held by the web line, acting as a colossal pendulum. The servo skull, still blinded, drifted directly into its path. The impact was titanic. The skull was swatted from the air like a fly, smashing against the far wall in a shower of sparks, shattered bone, and broken machinery. An alarm klaxon began to blare, a harsh, insistent shriek, but the skull's destruction had a secondary effect. A cascade of sparks erupted from the control panel its wires led back to. The lights in the room flickered, and the hum of the stasis cuffs on Peter's wrists died with a final, pathetic whine. The power was cut. His strength flooded back into him, a tingling, exhilarating rush. The chair was still just a chair, the restraints just metal. With a roar of effort that was part pain, part triumph, he flexed. The metal groaned, bent, and then shattered. He was free. The stone door to the chamber began to slide open, Scions rushing in with their hell guns leveled. They were too late. Peter was already in motion. He leaped over their heads, his hands slapping against the ceiling, sticking for a moment. He used the momentum to propel himself down the corridor outside, a red and blue blur of motion. He was in a sterile, featureless Imperial corridor. There was no clear path out, no windows. Just endless, intersecting hallways of grey metal and eagle iconography. He didn't need a map. He just needed to get away from the Imperium and back to the hunt. He took off running, his unnatural speed a blur. Alarms blared throughout the facility. The mutant has escaped. All units, lock down protocols. Peter Parker was loose inside an inquisitorial fortress. He had no allies, no knowledge of the layout, and was being hunted by the best soldiers in the Imperium. But for the first time since arriving in this universe, he felt a sense of control. He had made a choice. He wasn't Valerius's weapon or his prisoner. He was his own agent, an unholy, unsanctioned, and utterly necessary alliance of one. The hunt for the Lictor was back on. The escape was a symphony of controlled chaos. Alarms shrieked, ricocheting off the cold, sterile metal of the inquisitorial fortress. Crimson-armored scions moved with terrifying speed and precision, establishing kill zones, covering intersections, and sweeping corridors with overlapping fields of fire. Their tactics were flawless, honed by centuries of Imperial doctrine. They were prepared for a soldier, a heretic, or a demon. They were not prepared for a spider. Peter didn't use the corridors. He used the spaces above them. He punched a hole through a ceiling grate and entered the labyrinthine network of ventilation shafts and power conduits that was the fortress's true circulatory system. Here, in the cramped, dusty darkness, their numbers and firepower meant nothing. His spider sense gave him a perfect, three-dimensional map of their movements, a web of danger signals he could effortlessly navigate around. He heard them below him, their vox chatter a mixture of professional calm and growing frustration. Negative contact, Sector Gamma 9. Auspex shows a transient biological sign, then nothing. He moved with absolute silence, a ghost in their machine. He found an unguarded waste reclamation chute, a vertical shaft leading down to the hive's underbelly. Without a moment's hesitation, he plunged into it, sliding down a waterfall of refuse and filth, the stench so overpowering it made his eyes water. He emerged feet first into a vast, cavernous cistern deep in the underhive, splashing into a knee-deep pool of stagnant, chemical-laced water. He was out. He was free. And he was covered in garbage. For the next several cycles, Peter Parker became a phantom. He established a new lair, a roost fit for a spider in the shattered, derelict dome of an ancient astropathic relay station that jutted out from the hive wall a mile above the sump floor. No one came up here. The gantries had collapsed a century ago, leaving it accessible only to the winged vermin of the hive. And to him. From this vantage point, he could see the ceaseless, uncaring industry of Hive Primus laid out below him, a million tiny lights in an artificial night. His first priority was his web shooters. He carefully dismantled one of the cartridges, analyzing the remaining fluid. It was a complex polymer, a long-chain carbon molecule he had invented in a high school lab. Replicating it here seemed impossible. But science, like life, found a way. He began a new, desperate kind of hunt. He would swing down into the industrial zones, the chem pits and the manufactorums, a silent observer. He used the rudimentary lenses in his mask, which he'd painstakingly repaired, to analyze the chemical runoff, the industrial solvents, the gaseous byproducts. He borrowed a data slate from an engine seer's workshop, and while he couldn't understand the litanies to the machine god, he could understand the chemical formulas and engineering diagrams. He became a scavenger, a length of copper wiring here, a canister of polymerization agent there. He built a makeshift centrifuge from a discarded fan motor and synthesized a crude, but functional, version of his web fluid from the toxic dregs of the hive's industry. It wasn't as strong, and it was a hideous rust-brown color, but it worked. With his mobility secured, he turned his attention back to his self-imposed mission. He became the guardian of the forgotten, the protector of the powerless. The whispers of the ghost spinner began to solidify into a legend. A loan shark from a local gang, a brute named Grohl, was beating a merchant for failing to pay his tithe. As he raised his chain axe for the killing blow, a thick brown web suddenly gummed the weapon's teeth. Before he could react, his feet were yanked from under him, and he was hoisted into the air, sputtering and cursing. From the shadows above, a figure in a torn red and blue suit watched for a moment, ensuring the merchant was safe, then vanished. Grohl was found an hour later, webbed to the spire of a hab block, with a note stuck to his chest written in synthesized webbing, "Pick on someone your own size." He never stayed to be thanked. He never made a grand declaration. He was a flash of motion, a timely intervention, and then he was gone. He stopped muggings, broke up slave gangs trading in human misery, and even saved a child who had fallen from a high gantry, catching her in a web net just feet from the chasm floor. To the downtrodden people of the underhive, ground under the heel of gangers, arbitrators, and a merciless Imperium, he was a miracle. A spot of impossible color in a world of rust and gray. A spark of hope. But his primary focus was always the Lictor. His spider sense was now finely tuned to its unique, cold signature. Twice more, he felt the telltale spike of its predatory intent. The first time, it was stalking a group of miners near a slag pit. Peter didn't engage directly. He caused a rock slide, creating a massive, noisy diversion that sent the miners scrambling for safety and convinced the Lictor its hunt was compromised. It vanished. The second time was more perilous. He felt the Lictor's presence inside a sealed-off medici station. He broke in through a skylight and found the creature standing over the beds of the sick and the dying, its feeder tendrils extended as if tasting the very air of their infirmity. He attacked without hesitation, a whirlwind of acrobatic fury. The battle was short and violent, a chaotic dance amidst the sterile machinery. He drove it back, his less effective webs still providing enough of a nuisance to frustrate its cold biological calculus. He landed a solid kick that sent it crashing through a wall, and it faded into the darkness rather than press the fight. He had saved them. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was only treating the symptoms, not the disease. He was playing defense, a goalie in a game that stretched across the entire miserable hive. He was winning battles, but he was losing the war. The Lictor was still out there, still learning, still tasting. Sooner or later it would gather what it needed and call its masters. He sat in his high perch, looking down at the hive city that had become his prison and his parish. He had become a legend, a symbol of hope to the hopeless. But that wasn't enough. Hope wouldn't stop a hive fleet. He needed to find the Lictor. He needed to hunt the hunter. Reacting wasn't good enough anymore. He had to be proactive. His gaze fell upon the modified lenses of his mask, which he had been using to analyze chemical compositions. The Lictor was a biological creature. It left traces. The almost invisible purple slime, the pheromones Valerius had mentioned. They were a trail if only he had the senses to follow it. An idea began to form, a brilliant fusion of Terran science and underhive salvage. He could modify his lenses, tweak his web shooters. He could build a tracker. The plan was audacious, desperate, and pure Peter Parker. To track a ghost, he needed to see the invisible. The first step was the most dangerous. He needed a fresh sample. Waiting for the Lictor to attack again was not an option. He had to go to a place it had been and pray it had left something behind. He swung back towards the Medici station, a place now marked for demolition by the local enforcers. He slipped through the cordon of hazard tape, a silent shadow in the gloom. Inside, the scene of his last battle was a wreck of overturned beds and shattered diagnostic equipment. He switched his mask's lenses to their highest magnification, scanning every surface. His heart sank. The place had been scoured by the hive's automated cleaning drones, the lobotomized servitors leaving behind the scent of industrial disinfectant. Then, he saw it. Behind a dislodged wall panel, a place the drones had missed, was a single, tiny smear of the translucent purple fluid he'd seen before. It was almost completely evaporated, but a minuscule residue remained, barely a molecule thick. Using a sterile Medicae vial he'd salvaged, he carefully scraped the sample. He had his bait. Back in his derelict dome, surrounded by a chaotic tangle of scavenged parts, he began to work. This was his element. Not the brawling and acrobatics, but the quiet, focused intensity of creation. His lab was a testament to underhive resourcefulness. A cracked data slate served as a workbench, powered by a jury-rigged connection to a still-live municipal power conduit. A collection of stolen Mechanicus tools, their previous owners none the wiser, lay neatly arranged. His goal was to build a particle sniffer attuned to the Lictor's unique pheromonal signature, a piece of technology that would have taken a team of Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests a year of prayer and ritual to construct. Peter planned to have it working by the next cycle. He started by analyzing the sample. He needed a mass spectrometer, something he decidedly did not have. He improvised. He modified a long-range Vox bead, using its frequency modulator to bombard the sample with a spectrum of sonic waves. He then routed the feedback through the optical sensors in his mask's lenses, programming a simple algorithm to analyze the light refraction. It was a crude, ugly hack, but it worked. After hours of painstaking calibration, he isolated a unique molecular signature, a complex protein that glowed a faint, ethereal violet in his augmented vision. This was the Lictor's scent marker. Now he needed to turn that signature into a tracker. The key was a focusing crystal he had liberated from the targeting array of a wrecked Sentinel Walker he'd found in a scrap heap. He carefully integrated the crystal into his mask's optical assembly, linking it directly to the power cell of his left web shooter. He then wrote a simple targeting program on his data slate, filter out all other visual data, and highlight only the specific resonant frequency of the pheromone. He held his breath and activated the system. For a moment, nothing happened. The world through his lenses was the same drab canvas of rust and shadow. He felt a pang of disappointment. Then, it flickered. A faint, ghostly ribbon of violet light, almost imperceptible, was drifting from the sample vial. It was working. He could see the scent. He donned his mask, the world transforming. The underhive was now overlaid with a new layer of information. Faint, dissipating trails of violet vapor clung to the air, remnants of the Lictor's past movements. Most were days old, little more than disconnected wisps, but he knew a fresh trail would shine like a beacon. He swung out from his perch, a hunter on the prowl. He systematically swept the sectors where he'd felt the Lictor's presence, his new vision cutting through the darkness. For hours, he found nothing but cold trails. He was beginning to lose hope when, near the slag pit where he'd caused the rock slide, he saw it. A trail so bright, so vibrant, it looked like a river of ethereal purple fire. It was fresh, less than a cycle old. The hunt was on. He followed the glowing pheromone trail with a singular, obsessive focus. It did not follow walkways or gantries. It flowed up the sheer faces of hab blocks, through the grinding multi-ton gears of a promethium refinery, and across chasms on pipes no wider than his arm. It was a path only two beings in this entire hive could follow, the Lictor and him. As he moved, he realized the trail was leading him down, always down, past the grimy, populated levels of the underhive, past the abandoned industrial zones, into the hive's foundation. He descended into a region known only as the Sump, a place where the hive's oldest, most decrepit structures were slowly sinking into a sea of toxic sludge. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of chemical decay and 1 billion years of rot. The oppressive hum of the upper hive faded, replaced by an unnerving, dripping silence. The pheromone trail grew stronger, brighter. He was close, and then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Other, fainter trails were beginning to converge with his, weaving into the main path like tributaries into a river. The Lictor had been using this route for a long time. This was its main thoroughfare. The trail led him to the base of one of the Hive's original support pylons, a metal column a mile in diameter, crusted with millennia of corrosion. Here, at Hive Bottom, in a graveyard of forgotten machinery and collapsed structures, the trail ended abruptly at a colossal, sealed gate. It was not an Imperial design. It was older, its surface covered in strange, swirling glyphs he didn't recognize. A stylized, three-armed sigil, vaguely reminiscent of a claw, was carved above the gate's main lock. The vibrant purple pheromone trail didn't stop at the gate. It seeped through the microscopic cracks around its edges, pooling on the other side. The Lictor was inside. This was its lair. And from the sheer concentration of the pheromones, he knew it wasn't just a temporary hiding place. It was a nexus, a base of operations, the source of the whispers in the grime. He placed his hand on the cold, ancient metal of the gate. His spider sense, which had been a dull throb, began to pulse with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a malevolent heart. The danger wasn't just the Lictor anymore. The Lictor was just the guard dog. Whatever it was protecting was behind this door. Peter pressed his ear to the cold metal of the ancient gate. He heard nothing. No machinery. No voices. But his spider sense was a low, insistent drumbeat, a rhythm of dread that told him he was at the epicenter of the danger he'd been tracking for weeks. The Lictor was in there. And it was not alone. Opening the gate was a problem of brutal mechanics. The lock was a colossal tumbler system, far too large for any lockpick. There was no electronic signature to hack. It was a relic of a forgotten age. For anyone else, it would have been impassable. But Peter had a unique set of tools. He found a tiny seam where the two massive doors met, a gap no wider than a piece of paper. With a grunt, he dug his fingertips in, his superhuman strength finding purchase. He pulled. Metal shrieked in protest as he widened the gap, just enough to peer inside. It was dark, but he could make out the lock's internal mechanism, a series of colossal, interlocking gears, each one the size of a manhole cover. He fired a single, hardened strand of his new, rust-brown webbing through the gap, the tip sharpened and stiffened with a focused chemical mix. It was a probe. He maneuvered it with painstaking precision, nudging the first gear. It was heavy, but it moved. One by one, he used the web line as a lever, a finger, a key, manipulating the ancient tumblers from the inside. After 10 minutes of intense concentration, there was a deep, resonant thud as the final gear settled into place. A low hiss of depressurized air followed, and the colossal gate groaned open a few inches, just enough for him to slip through. He slid into the darkness, and the gate hissed shut behind him, sealing him in. The air inside was thick, warm, and wet, and the Lictor's pheromonal scent was so strong it was almost overpowering. It was mixed with another, stranger smell, a cloying, sickly sweet aroma, like rotting fruit and strange incense. He activated his modified lenses. The pheromone trail was no longer a trail. It was a blinding, ambient fog of violet light. But through the haze, he saw the source. He was in a vast, circular chamber, clearly of pre-Imperial construction. The walls were not made of metal, but of a smooth, black stone that seemed to absorb the light. Strange, bioluminescent fungi grew in patches, casting an eerie blue-green glow. In the center of the chamber was a grotesque parody of a throne or an altar. It was a pulsating, fleshy structure of living biomatter, veined with purple and blue, and seemed to have been grown from the floor. It was the source of the sweet, rotting smell, and tending to it were people. He recognized some of them from the picked files of the missing persons he had seen on the Arbites' data slates, the family of 4 from the Hab unit, a crew of miners, a factorium worker. They were all here, dozens of them moving with a silent, hypnotic grace. Their skin was pale, their eyes wide and staring with a kind of ecstatic vacancy. They were not prisoners. They were acolytes. They hummed a low, monotonous chant as they caressed the fleshy walls of the chamber, tending to the fungi, their humanity stripped away and replaced with a terrifying, serene purpose. This was the Lictor's harvest. It wasn't just killing them, it was choosing them, it was gathering the seed stock for this. The nascent stirrings of a genestealer cult. Peter's eyes were drawn back to the central biomass. Nestled in a hollow at its peak, almost like a monstrous egg in a nest, was a creature larger than the others, its form still partially gestating. It had 4 powerful arms ending in razor-sharp claws, a ridged, armored head, and an intelligence in its eyes that was ancient and malevolent. The Patriarch, the psychic heart of the cult. Then his pheromone vision adjusted to the overwhelming signal, and he saw it. Clinging to the ceiling directly above the Patriarch's throne, perfectly still, was the Lictor. It was flattened against the stone, its chameleonic skin mimicking the texture and color of the rock so perfectly it was invisible to the naked eye. But through his lenses, its pheromonal signature was a tightly coiled knot of brilliant violet energy. It was dormant, a silent guardian, a sentinel watching over its unholy cradle. Peter froze, clinging to the shadows near the entrance. He had found the Lictor's nest. He had found the source of the disappearances. He had stumbled into the secret heart of a Xenos infection that could doom this entire hive. Valerius and his scions were fools, searching the upper levels with flamethrowers, while the true cancer was metastasizing down here in the roots of the city. He had to get out. He had to warn someone. Even Valerius had to listen to this. He began to back away, his movements slow, measured, silent. He was halfway to the gate when a small child, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, stopped her humming. She had been tracing the patterns on a pulsating vein on the wall. She turned her head, her movements unnaturally fluid. Her eyes, wide and black, locked directly onto his position in the shadows. There was no recognition, no fear, just a silent, psychic acknowledgement. She raised a single, small finger and pointed directly at him. A wave of psychic pressure slammed into Peter's mind. It wasn't the agonizing shriek of his spider sense. It was a focused, commanding whisper that echoed in his skull, a voice that was not a voice, speaking a single, silent word: intruder. Every single cultist stopped what they were doing. In perfect, horrifying unison, their heads snapped around to stare at him. The serene, vacant looks in their eyes were gone, replaced by a cold, predatory hunger. On the ceiling, the Lictor's coiled pheromone signature exploded into a raging inferno of violet light. It unfurled from the stone, its scything talons clicking open, its multiple eyes glowing with renewed focus. The hunt was no longer a game of stealth and observation. The prey had walked into the predator's den. With a deep, grinding boom that shook the entire chamber, the massive stone gate he had entered through slid shut, plunging him into the eerie, bioluminescent twilight of the cult's sanctum. There was no lock to pick this time. He was trapped. The cultists began to advance, their movements no longer human, but a low, scuttling crouch. The Patriarch stirred on its throne, its ancient eyes fixing on him. And from the ceiling, the Lictor dropped silently to the floor, landing between Peter and the fleshy altar, its feeder tendrils uncoiling, its talons scraping against the stone floor. The hunt had been reversed. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prize, trapped in the heart of the nest. For a fleeting second, Peter was paralyzed by the sheer, alien wrongness of the scene. The silent, pointing child, the unified, hungry stare of the cultists, the living nightmare of the Patriarch on its throne, and the patient, waiting death of the Lictor. His spider sense wasn't just warning him of danger, it was screaming in a multi-front symphony of psychic, physical, and existential threat. Then his training took over. He moved. The cultists were the first wave, a tide of pale flesh and ecstatic fury. They were not soldiers, they were fanatics, their bodies twisted into unnatural scuttling gaits as they scrambled over each other to reach him. His first instinct was to strike, to clear a path. But he couldn't. He looked into their eyes, the vacant, puppeteered eyes of the miner, the hollowed-out gaze of the mother from the Habby unit, and saw that they were victims, puppets on a psychic string. Hurting them felt like a profound betrayal. "I don't want to hurt you," he yelled, the words feeling utterly futile. He leaped backwards, firing thick, brown webs not as weapons, but as barriers. He coated the floor in a slick, impassable sheet, sending the first wave of cultists tumbling into a heap. He webbed a dozen more to the walls, the impact webbing hardening into cocoons that restrained them without crushing them. He was a shepherd trying to corral a pack of rabid wolves, his every move defensive, his every action a desperate attempt to mitigate harm. But his focus on the cultists left him open. The Lictor exploded into motion. It was a blur of purple chitin, a living engine of scythes and claws. Peter's senses shrieked a half-second before the attack. He threw himself into a sideways roll as a scything talon carved a deep trench in the stone floor where he had been standing. He came up firing, plastering the creature's face with a glob of his crude webbing. It was a tactic that had worked before. This time, it didn't. The Lictor didn't even pause. It tore the webbing away with its smaller claws in a single, fluid motion, its multiple eyes burning with a cold, analytical fury. It had learned. It was adapting. As Peter dodged another lightning-fast strike, a new assault began, one he couldn't see. The Patriarch on its fleshy throne stirred, its large, bulbous head tilting. A wave of pure psychic force slammed into Peter's mind. It was a crushing, debilitating pressure filled with alien thoughts and a single, overriding command. Submit. His vision swam. For a moment, he saw not the dark chamber, but a swirling vortex of stars being devoured by a shadowy maw. He felt the colossal, unified consciousness of the hive mind, a trillion voices screaming a single word. Hunger. He felt his own individuality, his own sense of self, being scraped away, threatened with dissolution into that terrible cosmic hole. He staggered, clutching his head, the psychic assault more painful than any physical blow. The Lictor seized the opportunity. It lunged, not with its large talons, but with its body, ramming into him with the force of a freight train. Peter was thrown through the air, his back slamming into the chamber's far wall with a sickening crack. He felt at least 2 ribs break. The pain was sharp, blinding. Pinned against the wall, his head reeling from the psychic attack and his body screaming in agony, he saw the Lictor raise its talons for the final killing blow. This was it. This was how it ended. Trapped, broken, at the bottom of the world. And then he felt it, a deep, powerful vibration in the stone behind him. His eyes, desperate for any advantage, any way out, scanned the wall. He saw it. A colossal, armored pipe as thick as a tunnel was integrated into the ancient stone structure. It was an Imperial addition, a piece of the Hive's infrastructure that had been bored through this forgotten chamber centuries ago. Faded, archaic warning runes were stenciled on its side, along with the crest of the Adeptus Mechanicus. He couldn't read the words, but he recognized the universal symbol for extreme pressure and hazardous material. A plasma coolant conduit. A main line, judging by its size, likely running from a geothermal tap deep below to one of the primary plasma reactors miles above in the spire. An idea, terrible and desperate, ignited in his mind. If he could rupture that pipe. His spider sense, already a cacophony, gave him a new, terrifying vision. It wasn't a warning for him, it was a premonition. He saw the conduit rupture, a jet of superheated plasma venting upwards with unimaginable force. He saw the explosion tearing through the hive's superstructure, a catastrophic vertical chain reaction. And he saw a hab block, designated Sector 94 Delta, on a flickering status plate, 2 levels directly above this chamber. He saw the homes of hundreds of people, workers, families, children, vaporized in an instant, the entire sector collapsing into the fiery abyss he would create. He saw their faces, innocent, unsuspecting. They were not cultists, they were not soldiers, they were just people living their miserable, oppressed lives, completely unaware of the monster beneath their feet, or the one who was about to become their executioner. The Lictor lunged. Peter reacted on pure instinct, firing a web line at the ceiling and pulling himself up, the talons slashing the stone where his head had been. He hung there, dangling from the ceiling, his ribs a fire of agony. Below him, the cultists swarmed, their hands reaching for him. The Patriarch intensified its psychic assault, screaming despair and die into his mind. The Lictor was coiling, preparing to leap. He had a choice, a terrible, impossible choice. Let the cult succeed, and this entire world, this entire billion-soul hive, would be consumed. The Lictor would send its signal, the fleet would arrive, and everyone would die, or he could rupture the conduit. He could stop the cult here, now, by burying it under a mountain of fire and twisted metal. He could save 1 billion lives, by murdering hundreds. Valerius's cold, pragmatic voice echoed in his memory. Individual lives have no value. The continued survival of humanity has value. He looked down at the pointing child, her face a mask of alien serenity. He saw the Lictor, a perfect killing machine. He heard the Patriarch's psychic promise of a galaxy of endless hunger. With a sob of raw anguish, a sound of a soul breaking, he made his choice. He fired his web shooter, not a line, not a glob. He overrode the nozzle limiter, forcing all the pressure into a single, hyper-concentrated stream. A hard, needle-thin jet of his rust-brown polymer shot across the chamber and struck the conduit's primary pressure valve with the force of a rifle bullet. For a moment, there was only a high-pitched whine. Then, a groan of tortured metal. A hairline fracture appeared in the conduit's armored shell. Then, with a deafening, world-ending roar, the wall exploded. The world ended in a roar of white-hot energy. The plasma conduit didn't just rupture, it detonated. A blinding spear of incandescent light and heat, the very lifeblood of the hive's reactors, erupted into the chamber. The psychic scream of the Patriarch was snuffed out in an instant, a candle flame in a thermonuclear blast. The chamber, the fleshy throne, the chanting acolytes, they were all gone, vaporized in a microsecond of absolute annihilation. Peter was saved only by the web line still attached to the ceiling. The initial blast wave threw him like a rag doll, slamming him against the far side of the dome just as the plasma jet scoured the chamber's center. The heat was so intense it flash-cooked the outer layer of his suit, the smart fabric turning brittle and black. The pain was a distant, secondary concern to the sheer, overwhelming force of the explosion. Then came the collapse. The structural integrity of the hive's foundation, compromised by the blast, gave way. The entire ceiling groaned, buckled, and then began to fall. Massive chunks of ancient stone and Imperial plasteel, each weighing tons, rained down into the fiery abyss he had created. His spider sense, a single, sustained shriek of terminal velocity, screamed at him. He had seconds. With his last vestiges of strength, he shot a web line across a narrow chasm that had opened in the wall, pulling himself into a small reinforced service conduit. He then emptied a full cartridge of his remaining web fluid, creating a thick, multi-layered cocoon of brown polymer around the conduit's opening, sealing himself in just as the world outside came crashing down. The sound was a grinding, world-breaking apocalypse of tearing metal and shattering rock that went on for an eternity. When the noise finally subsided, replaced by the crackle of 1,000 fires and the drip of molten slag, Peter tore his way out of the cocoon. He was in a pocket of space within the rubble, a tomb of twisted metal. He was alive, but barely. His ribs were a galaxy of agony. His suit was a tattered ruin, and his left arm was badly burned. Through a gap in the debris, he could see the result of his choice. The cult's sanctum was gone. In its place was a vast, glowing cavern of magma and fire, the plasma still venting upwards in a shimmering, deadly plume. He had done it. He had stopped the cult. The thought brought no triumph, only a hollow, sickening ache. He could still see the faces of the people in Sector 94 Delta. Their homes now the roof of this raging inferno. A sudden movement in the hellscape below drew his attention. Something was climbing out of the molten rock. It was a skeletal figure, wreathed in flame, its chitin scorched black and cracked. Its chameleon properties were gone, burned away, leaving its purple-grey hide a hideous patchwork of charred flesh. One of its scything talons had been snapped off at the joint, leaving a jagged stump. It was the Lictor. It had survived. It had been at the edge of the blast, shielded by the chaos, and its alien physiology had withstood a temperature that should have turned it to ash. The psychic link to the Patriarch and the hive mind was gone, severed by the explosion and the sheer psychic trauma of the event. For the first time in its existence, the Lictor was alone. And all of its focused, predatory instinct, once a tool of a greater consciousness, was now condensed into a singular, burning point of pure hatred aimed directly at him. It saw him, its multiple glowing eyes fixed on his position. It let out a shriek that was no longer a calculated alien sound, but a raw, guttural scream of pure rage. It began to climb the sheer, unstable cliff of debris, its remaining talon and claws finding purchase in the hot, twisted metal. Peter knew he couldn't fight it here. He would be cooked alive or buried. He looked up. The explosion had not only collapsed the chamber below, but had also punched clean through the floor of the structure above. He could see broken arches and shattered stone against a backdrop of rising smoke, a way out. He fired his last fully loaded web cartridge, the line soaring up through the jagged hole in the ceiling. He pulled himself up, his body screaming in protest, and scrambled onto the floor of the chamber above just as the Lictor's clawed hand reached the ledge. He was in a cathedral, a vast, derelict temple to the God Emperor. Colossal, dust-choked stained-glass windows depicted angelic, power-armored figures smiting grotesque green creatures. Towering statues of a skeletal figure on a golden throne stood in silent judgment, their stone faces cracked and weathered. The air was thick with the dust of ages and the acrid smoke from the fire below. A massive chasm, a fresh wound in the cathedral's marble floor, opened up into the inferno he had created. The Lictor pulled itself up out of the chasm, a monster climbing from the mouth of hell. It stood there, silhouetted against the raging fire, a scorched and broken thing of pure vengeance. The final battle had found its stage. There were no more tricks, no more hit-and-run tactics. The Lictor was no longer a patient hunter. It charged, a berserker fury, its one remaining talon held high. Peter, running on nothing but adrenaline and iron will, met the charge. The fight was a brutal, desperate brawl. He dodged the sweeping talon, the blade cracking a stone pillar in half. He slid under a lunge, feeling the heat of the creature's rage wash over him. He used the environment, toppling a 10-foot-tall stone eagle onto the creature, only for it to shrug off the tons of rock and keep coming. He landed a punch on its head, the blow cracking its already scorched chitin. The Lictor retaliated with a backhand from one of its smaller claws, the blow catching him in the ribs. The pain was so white-hot, he almost blacked out. He staggered back, his vision blurring. The Lictor saw its opening. It raised its talon for the final blow, a clean, decapitating strike. Peter, desperate, fired a web line, one of his last, at the base of a massive, half-shattered pipe organ that loomed over the altar. He pulled. The ancient instrument, its support struts weakened by the explosion, groaned and then toppled forward, crashing down directly onto the lictor. The creature was buried under a mountain of shattered wood and twisted metal pipes. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire below. Peter leaned against a pillar, gasping for breath, his body a single, throbbing nerve of pain. But it wasn't over. The wreckage began to shift. The lictor rose from the debris, shaking off the organ as if it were a blanket. It was wounded, its movements slower, but its eyes still burned with that same undiluted hatred. It was relentless, unstoppable. Peter knew with a sudden, sinking clarity that he could not win. He couldn't kill it. He was too injured, too exhausted. And even if he could, the act of taking its life, of crossing that final line, felt like a surrender to the brutality of this universe. There had to be another way. He looked at the lictor, then at the fiery chasm in the center of the floor. A new plan, his last, most desperate gamble, formed in his mind. He couldn't kill it, but maybe, just maybe, he could bury it. He took a deep, ragged breath, the dust and smoke searing his lungs. He pushed himself off the pillar, forcing his battered body to respond, and stood in the center of the cathedral floor, deliberately positioning himself between the enraged lictor and the fiery chasm. He was bait. "Come on," he yelled, his voice hoarse and cracking. "You want me? Come and get me." The lictor, its alien mind now stripped down to the singular, primal imperative of vengeance, accepted the invitation. It charged, its one remaining talon held low like a charging bull's horn, aimed directly at his midsection. It was no longer using finesse or tactics, just brute, overwhelming force. This was what Peter was counting on. As the creature bore down on him, a 9-foot-tall juggernaut of scorched chitin and raw fury, Peter stood his ground. His spider sense was a single, sustained note of impending doom, a high-frequency scream that told him death was a fraction of a second away. He waited. 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 Now. At the last possible instant, as the tip of the talon was mere inches from his body, he dropped. He didn't dive or roll. He simply let his legs go limp, falling straight down. The talon sliced through the empty air above him with a vicious hiss. At the same time, he fired his web shooters, both of them, aiming not at the lictor, but at the floor on either side of it. 2 thick brown lines of webbing shot out, anchoring themselves to the marble floor. As the lictor's momentum carried it over his prone body, he used the last of his strength to pull on the web lines, creating a tripwire. The lictor's multi-jointed legs, designed for stealth and speed, tangled in the unexpectedly strong and sticky strands. Its charge, already off balance from the missed strike, became an uncontrollable tumble. It let out a frustrated, gurgling shriek as it tripped, its massive body pitching forward. It was not a graceful fall. It was a catastrophic, flailing crash, its momentum carrying it directly towards the edge of the chasm. It scrabbled for purchase, its claws and remaining talons scoring deep, useless gouges in the smooth marble. For a moment, it teetered on the brink, its glowing eyes wide with what might have been the alien equivalent of shock. Then, with a final, despairing screech, it tipped over the edge and fell into the inferno below. Peter lay on the floor, his cheek pressed against the cold stone, and watched it fall. It did not die instantly. It thrashed in the plume of plasma, a dark, skeletal shape against the blinding white light, its body slowly breaking apart, its limbs incinerated one by one, until finally it was consumed completely. It was gone. Silence descended upon the ruined cathedral, a profound, ringing silence broken only by the low, hungry roar of the plasma fire from the chasm. It was over. He had won. He had defeated the lictor. He had saved the hive, He had murdered hundreds of innocent people to do it. The cost of his victory washed over him, a wave of nausea and self-loathing that was more painful than any of his physical injuries. The faces he had seen in his precognitive flash, the mother singing a lullaby to her child, the old man cleaning his work tools, the children playing a game with bottle caps. They were all dead. Their homes were a crater of molten slag because of him. He had made the Inquisitor's choice. He had done the monstrous arithmetic, sacrificing the few to save the many, and the act had hollowed him out, leaving a scar on his soul that would never heal. He pushed himself up, every muscle, every bone, screaming in protest. His suit hung from him in scorched tatters. His web shooters were empty. He was a wreck, a ghost of his former self. He looked at his hands, trembling and covered in soot and grime. They were the hands of a hero. They were the hands of a killer. He didn't know the difference anymore. He began to limp towards the cathedral's shattered entrance, his one goal to get away, to disappear back into the anonymity of the underhive's shadows. He needed to find a place to hide, to heal, to try and piece together the shattered fragments of his own morality. As he reached the great, broken doors of the cathedral, a sound made him freeze. It was the crisp, disciplined sound of armored boots on stone. He flattened himself against the side of the doorway, peering out. A squad of tempestuous scions, their crimson armor immaculate against the grime, were securing the area. And with them, standing before the chasm and looking down into the fire with a look of cold, analytical satisfaction, was Inquisitor Valerius. He must have tracked the energy signature of the plasma explosion. He had come to see the results. Auspec's readings confirm, one of the scions reported, his voice crisp and professional. The primary Xenos biosignature has been terminated. The secondary signatures are also gone. The nest has been purged, my lord. Valerius nodded, a flicker of something that might have been approval in his cold eyes. A crude but effective solution, exterminatus on a miniature scale. The collateral damage in the upper hab block is acceptable, a necessary sacrifice. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the ruined cathedral. The mutant anomaly, designated Spinner. What is its status? No biosigns detected, my lord, the scion replied. It is most likely that the creature was terminated in the initial blast, along with the cultists. It served its purpose. Valerius stood for a long moment, his hand resting on the silver eye at his neck. A shame, he murmured, his voice low. It could have been a useful weapon. But chaotic, unpredictable weapons have a tendency to misfire. This is a cleaner outcome. He turned to his men. Sanitize the area. Report the structural collapse as a result of seismic instability caused by the Xenos' burrowing. The legend of the ghost spinner ends here, buried and forgotten. The Emperor's work is done. Hidden in the shadows, his body screaming in agony and his soul in turmoil, Peter Parker watched them. He was a ghost, a weapon that had been used and discarded. His victory was a secret, his sacrifice a statistic, his existence an inconvenience that had been conveniently erased. He had saved this world, and in return, it had taken everything from him, including his own belief in what it meant to be a hero. He was alone, truly and completely, in the grim, unforgiving darkness. He slipped away as the scions began their grim work, a wounded animal fading back into the urban jungle that had become his cage. Every movement was a fresh agony. The journey back to his derelict perch in the astropathic dome was a blur of pain, a desperate, stumbling climb through the hive's forgotten arteries. He didn't swing. He crawled, pulled himself up, and limped through service tunnels, leaving a faint trail of blood and soot. By the time he collapsed onto the cold floor of his sanctuary, consciousness was a fraying thread. He lay there for 2 full cycles, drifting in and out of a feverish state. His dreams were a hellish slideshow of fire, falling debris, and the wide, accusing eyes of children he had never met, but had condemned to death. Valerius's words haunted him, a cold, logical poison. Acceptable collateral damage. A necessary sacrifice. The Inquisitor's worldview was a monstrous thing, built on the bones of trillions, yet in this one terrible instance, it had been validated. Peter had pulled the trigger that Valerius would have ordered, pulled without a moment's hesitation. The thought was a violation, a deep, ideological wound that festered worse than his burns. His body, however, was a miracle of science and sheer luck. His accelerated healing, a gift he had so often taken for granted, went to work. The broken ribs knitted together with agonizing slowness. The burns on his arm scabbed, blistered, and began to heal, leaving behind angry, puckered scars. The deep, weary ache in his soul, however, did not fade. When he was finally able to stand, he caught his reflection in a shard of broken glass. He saw a stranger, a gaunt, haunted figure with hollowed-out eyes, his boyish face aged by a trauma no one from his world could ever comprehend. His suit, the vibrant red and blue symbol of a simpler time, of a hero who believed in clean victories, was a ruined mockery. He tore it off, piece by piece, the act of final, painful shedding of his old identity. Peter Parker, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, had died in that fire. The question was, who or what was left? For a time, the answer was nothing. He huddled in his dome, a ghost in his own life, listening to the ceaseless hum of the hive. He was done. He had failed. He had become the very thing he fought against, a force of death and destruction. Responsibility in this galaxy was a curse that led only to damnation. But the city below did not sleep, and its misery was a constant broadcast. A week after the explosion, he began to move again, a restless phantom drawn by a force he could no longer deny. He needed to see. He swung, slowly and painfully, his newly synthesized brown webbing a dull scar against the hive's metal skin, towards the sealed-off perimeter of what was once Sector 94 Delta. The Imperium was efficient. A massive, 20-foot-thick plasteel wall had been erected, bearing the skull and eagle of the Adeptus Arbits and a stark warning. Structural instability, access forbidden, by order of the Hive Primus Magistratum. There was no memorial, no acknowledgement of the lives lost, just a wall, a warning, and a lie. But the people of the underhive knew. On the grimy floor before the wall, a small, pathetic shrine had appeared. A few dozen spent ration bar wrappers, a handful of crudely carved wooden figurines, a child's worn-out shoe. It was a monument of trash, a testament to the fact that even in this hell people remembered. They mourned. He watched from the shadows as a woman, her face a mask of grief, placed a single, wilted fungus flower at the base of the wall before being shoved along by a passing Arbits patrolman. And in that moment, something inside Peter shifted. Valerius was wrong. The Inquisitor, with his grand galactic calculus, had missed the most important variable in the equation. Individual lives did have value. They had value to the people who loved them, to the children who depended on them, to the community that mourned them. Their value wasn't measured on a strategic map in an Inquisitor's sanctum, but in the small, defiant act of laying a dead flower at a cold, metal wall. The fire had not burned away his responsibility. It had forged it into something harder, something tempered by the grim reality of this universe. He couldn't be the hero he was. That hero was too bright, too loud, too naive for this world of shadows, but he could be the hero this world needed. He returned to his perch with a new grim purpose. He took the darkest, most durable scraps of his old suit and began to stitch them together with scavenged sin leather and flack weave cloth he'd taken from a dead ganger's armor. He built a new suit, a thing of shadow and function. The base was a deep, mottled gray, the color of hive steel. The spider emblem on his chest was gone, replaced by a stark, web-like pattern of his brown webbing, hardened into a makeshift armor plate. He fashioned a new mask from reinforced leather, its lenses now permanently set to the pheromone tracking frequency, a constant reminder of his hunt. He was no longer Spider-Man, he was the Ghost Spinner, not a symbol of hope, for hope was a lie in the 41st millennium. He was a symbol of consequence, a whisper in the dark that told the predators of the underhive that even here, in the deepest, most forgotten corners of the Imperium's cruelty, there was something that hunted back. His first act in his new guise was small, almost insignificant. He saw a hulking forge worker, his body a mass of vat-grown muscle, corner a young boy who had tried to steal a piece of scrap metal. The boy was crying, cornered, the man's shadow swallowing him whole. The old Peter would have swung in with a quip. The ghost spinner was silent. A single brown web line shot from the darkness, plucking the scrap metal from the boy's hand. A second web line snagged the bully's ankle, hoisting him upside down. The boy, stunned, looked around for his savior, but saw only shadows. He scrambled away. Safe. The ghost spinner watched from the ceiling, a silent, grey predator. The hunt was not over. It had just begun. If you enjoyed this cosmic collision of lore, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more Warhammer 40K what-if stories, and ring the bell of notification to join the crusade. What would you have done in Spider-Man's position? Let us know in the comments below. The story of what happened when Spider-Man faced a Tyranid Lictor is not a tale of triumph, but of transformation. A hero defined by an absolute moral code was thrown into a galaxy forged from brutal compromise, and he did not emerge unscathed. He was confronted with a horror on a cosmic scale and a choice so monstrous it forced him to sacrifice a piece of his own soul to save a world that would never know his name. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, Peter Parker learned the hardest lesson of all. That the line between a necessary sacrifice and an unforgivable crime can be erased by the calculus of survival. He won the battle. The Lictor was destroyed, the Genestealer cult purged, and Hive Primus was saved from the vanguard of the Great Devourer. But he lost the war for his own innocence. His old identity, the bright and hopeful Spider-Man, was burned away in the plasma fire of his own making, leaving behind a scarred and cynical survivor. He is now the Ghost Spinner, a whispered legend in the underhive, a creature of shadow who protects the forgotten masses not with hope, but with a grim and silent efficiency. Though Inquisitor Valerius believes the anomaly is dead, the myth of a mutant hero who hunts the darkness persists, an unsolved variable in the Imperium's rigid equation of control. Stranded a universe away from home, with no clear path of return, Peter Parker embraces his new, lonely responsibility. He can no longer be a friendly neighborhood hero, but in a galaxy that has forgotten the meaning of the word, he has become something far more necessary, a flicker of consequence in the overwhelming, oppressive dark.